OK, well now to tonight's guest, the new leader of the Liberal Party, Tony Abbott. He's taken on the job with the opposition travelling poorly in the polls and a big task ahead, reuniting the party. He joined us just a short time ago, and a warning, the interview does contain some strong language. Tony Abbott, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Tony.
Malcolm Turnbull says you can't cut greenhouse emissions without putting a price on carbon. Now, it appears you disagree, but would you change your mind if the United States puts a price on carbon?
Well, plainly, that would change a lot because the United States is at the heart of the international economy. It certainly makes no sense whatsoever for Australia to go down this path in the absence of the United States, and that's why I say that there is no way that we will have an emissions tax in place prior to an election, because there's no way that the United States will have this done prior to an election.
You can't know that for sure, but it sounds like, in fact, in principle, you've got an open mind on having an emissions tax of some sort if the United States does it.
Well, I'm not saying that an emissions tax is ever going to be good policy. We have the IMF itself coming out just the other day attacking the idea of an emissions trading system. So I'm not saying that an emissions tax is good policy. But if the whole world changes, obviously Australia has to respond intelligently to those changes.
So if the world moves to some sort of global system to regulate greenhouse emissions, which puts a price on those emissions, you'd actually advocate that Australia would have to be part of that?
No, Tony. I'm just saying that if circumstances change, we have to adapt to those changing circumstances.
But that's precisely the sort of circumstance we might be talking about.
Yeah, but we might be talking about all sorts of things. The fact is we are in the world as it is now, and the only person who wants to save the world on his own is Kevin Rudd. The only person who wants to move in advance of all the other countries is Kevin Rudd. And moving in advance of all the other countries will damage our economy without helping the environment.
President Obama's regulators now have the power to regulate, effectively, greenhouse emissions in the same way that they regulate other dangerous pollutants. Mm-hmm. Should that happen here? Well,
I certainly am not advocating that. And the interesting thing about this move is that it will expose an enormous number of ordinary businesses and indeed ordinary people going about ordinary life to massively greater regulation. And I think this is a very unsettling prospect, Tony. I think that ordinary Americans will be hardly thrilled to think that they are going to find their daily lives subject to this kind of close, detailed, possibly criminal regulation.
We'll go to the reasons for it shortly. But first of all, Malcolm Turnbull, once again, says you cannot cut emissions without a cost. Someone has to pay. That's what he says. He said in his blog yesterday. Mm-hmm. He said that any suggestion that you can dramatically cut emissions without any cost is, quote, bullshit.
I would also refer people to Malcolm's speech in January, where he talked about all the things that you could do to quite dramatically cut emissions without a new tax. Now, I'm not saying that all of the things in that speech are cost-free. Of course I'm not saying that. But much of what was in that speech would, in the long run, pay for itself because of the savings in reduced use of energy or the savings in better yields from agricultural land.
But is the point that he's making about the cost of emissions, is the point that he's making true or not true? Is it, as he says you would put it, bullshit?
Well, it's trivially true in the sense that if you try to do an enormous amount, you can spend an enormous amount of money. But there is a lot that you can do that won't cost massively, and certainly there is a lot that you can do that does not involve Kevin Rudd's giant new tax on everything and Kevin Rudd's money go round.
Right. Now, Malcolm Turnbull's also accused you in this famous blog of having a remarkable lack of conviction on this issue. He says you've had 5 different positions on the emissions trading scheme in as many months, and in that time, each time you came to him with a new one, you'd preface it with the words, mate, I know I'm a bit of a weather vane on this. Is that true?
Well, look, I'm not going to argue with Malcolm. I respect Malcolm's position.
No, you don't.
My argument...
You don't respect his position, otherwise you wouldn't have rolled him in order to become leader to get rid of it.
Obviously, Tony, I don't agree with much of his position on this subject, but that's not new news, and we're just going over old ground if we tell all of this. My argument is with Kevin Rudd and his giant new tax.
But did you tell Malcolm Turnbull you were a weather vane?
I don't recollect using that word, but I accept, Tony, that as circumstances have changed, as my insights have grown, as the politics of this have shifted, I've adapted. I actually thought that that was a good thing. If I might use Lord Keynes's phrase, when circumstances change, I change my view. What do you do, sir?
Let's go back a couple of steps. How much of an inspiration was John Howard in your decision to challenge for the Liberal leadership?
John was a spectator to that decision. Much as I admire John and much as I value his counsel, this was my decision. I didn't ask John about it in advance. I didn't seek his advice on it. I didn't want anyone else's fingerprints but my own to be on this one.
Did you speak to him about it at all?
No.
Because, I mean, he spoke to everyone else. He spoke to Joe Hockey in the famously secret meeting. He spoke to Malcolm Turnbull, apparently. Did you not speak to him at all?
I didn't talk to John before resigning from the front bench, and I didn't seek his advice on that.
Did you tell him of your plan to dump the emissions trading policy that he took to the last election?
Look, I think, Tony, that there are all sorts of conversations with all sorts of people. The important thing
That would be the most intriguing one, wouldn't it? Because you've relied on him to some degree as a political mentor.
Yes.
You talked about being a weather vane, seeing the changes in politics. Wouldn't you go to your old mentor to sort of seek his advice on something as fundamental as this?
Well, I continue to have discussions with the former Prime Minister, and I think that anyone on our side of politics who wants to grow in wisdom does well to have discussions with him. But I didn't want anyone else's fingerprints. Knowing that you would ask these sorts of questions, and others like you would ask these sorts of questions, Tony, I didn't want anyone to say that John Howard was still running the Liberal Party, and I didn't want anyone to say that notwithstanding the very close relationship that I've had with John over the years, that I am not my own man.
Did he give you any advice at all on whether it was a good idea to drop the emissions trading scheme that he took to the last election?
Well, you should ask him what he thinks about these things.
But you've been quite happy to say no about other things and be vague about this one.
His general view, Tony, and I don't think I'm putting words into his mouth, is that he did what he thought was best in his time, and it's now up to us to do what we think best in our time.
So he might, for example, believe the emissions trading scheme is not a good thing politically for this time and have advised you such.
Well, I'm just not going to go into what he might think about how the contemporary Liberal Party is handling things, because he's made it very clear that he isn't going to be a commentator on these events. What he wants is for us to maximise our chances of beating Kevin Rudd. What he wants to do is to stop the very damaging big new tax that Kevin Rudd wants to whack on all of us.
The same big new tax that he was going to bring in.
Well, he never wanted to do it unilaterally. The big difference between what was proposed in 2007 and what is now being proposed by Mr Rudd is that Mr Rudd doesn't care what the rest of the world does. As long as he had his trophy to take to Copenhagen, he was happy.
OK. Your original strategy to become Liberal leader did not include any move to do that during the first term of the Rudd Labor government. What changed your mind?
Well, I had no strategy to become Liberal leader. I had a strategy to stop supporting this bill. That was my strategy.
You appeared to have a strategy. You appeared to have a strategy, and you always said you kept the leadership baton in your knapsack.
And I was almost no one was more surprised than I was at the turn events had taken. I mean, the last thing I would have imagined in the last parliamentary sitting week was that within a week I would find myself as leader. What I wanted to do was to change our position on these bills. That's why I resigned from the front bench, because I could no longer in conscience support what we were proposing to do. And what I imagined would happen would be that if Malcolm didn't change his position and accept the sensible Minchin compromise, that someone like Joe Hockey would have emerged as our leader.
Okay. It happened. You're the leader.
Mm-hmm.
What's changed? What's shocked you since you've taken this job?
I guess the thing that has pleased me most is the way the party has rallied very strongly behind me and the way the public seems to have responded to our new position.
No, but that's not an interesting answer, if you don't mind me saying.
It's a good answer.
Well, it's a political answer. Yeah. It's a bit of spin. I'm more interested in a personal answer. What's changed? How do people behave towards you now differently?
Well, except for being perhaps more polite to my face and God knows what behind my back, I suppose the thing that I have noticed most is the incredibly difficult decisions that leaders have to make every day. For argument's sake, I've never had to pick a shadow ministry before. I've had lots of opinions about shadow ministries in the past, and I've certainly hung on the end of the phone line, sometimes in a greater state of frustration than others, waiting for the leader's call. But when you are actually the active ingredient in all of this, when you are the person who is sitting in judgment on other people's careers, at least in the short term, it's a very heavy responsibility, it's a very big burden, and I've got to say I have a lot more respect for everyone who is in that position.
Did you get what you wanted out of this shadow cabinet there? Did you get everything that you wanted? Because some people say you're trying to reinvent the John Howard cabinet. You've got 4 or 5 former Howard ministers in that cabinet.
And why not make the most of the experience and the energy that those people have? What I wanted was a front bench.
Let me, before you answer that, let me just throw something back at you. Paul Keating once called you a young fogey. I mean, you've done your reshuffle now, but are you at all worried that you're going to be regarded as a young fogey leading a bunch of old fogies?
Well, if we win the election, I'll be regarded as a genius. If we don't win, I'll probably be a political roadkill at some point in time. What I wanted, Tony, was a front bench that was going to take the fight to the government. What I wanted was a front bench that was going to make a contest of the next election. Not from the right, not from the left, but from the mainstream. A front bench that was going to articulate mainstream concerns about the new emissions tax, about the interest rate rises, about the loss of control of our borders, about all the broken promises of Mr Rudd. That's what I wanted, and I tell you what, I've got a pretty feisty team.
So you reckon you get one crack at this, do you? And if you fail, if you lose the next election badly, you're political roadkill, is that right?
The only thing I am focused on is winning the next election. Okay. The best thing I can do for the country and for the Liberal Party is focus every bit of my energy and drive on this coming contest.
Let's go back to Copenhagen. It seems the majority of the world's leaders are looking for big commitments to cut greenhouse emissions at this
from
meeting.
From other countries.
Indeed. But you believe the climate conference is nothing but propaganda, is that right?
Well, I think that there will be an enormous amount of spin. I haven't seen the video clip, if you like, which I gather is prefacing the whole thing, that's got young kids fleeing from a scorched earth, so to speak. I mean, this is not exactly balanced and dispassionate presentation, and I fear that that kind of emotionalism could well taint what goes on there.
Here's part of your exchange with Alan Jones on the radio this morning. Jones, how will the public withstand this propaganda? I mean, this is very heavy propaganda. Your reply, absolutely right. It's as if this is some sort of latter-day environmental Munich agreement. What on earth are you talking about?
Well, I think that what we're getting from a certain side of this argument is the view that the whole fate of the planet forever depends upon one meeting. Now, I'm not denying that this is an important meeting. Of course it's an important meeting, Tony. But there will be other meetings, there will be other decisions, and the important thing...
But the Munich Agreement, let's go back to what you actually said. The Munich Agreement was about weak leaders caving into Adolf Hitler. I mean, so what's your analogy about?
And what I'm saying is that we shouldn't pretend that the only important meeting that will ever take place on climate change is this one, and that the
What do you
last
mean by
and
the
only chance.
Just explain for us what you mean by a Munich agreement.
It was a throwaway line in which you would be wrong to invest too much significance. The important thing, Tony, is that we go to Copenhagen, that we make a constructive contribution, that we don't agree to anything at Copenhagen which is going to damage our economy without helping the environment.
Okay. Now, you also told Alan Jones you didn't believe it had actually warmed, the planet had warmed in the past decade. Now, on this program last night, we spoke to one of the world's leading climate scientists, NASA's James Hansen. Now, he runs the Goddard Institute of Space Science. It's one of the main organisations, I think you know this, that measure global temperatures. He says the data, according to the data they have now, that 2009 is likely to be one of the hottest years on record, 2009.
Yes, and also
he says that 2010 is very likely to be the hottest year on record.
And also,
if he proves to be right, if he proves to be right, what will that mean to you?
And also on this program, Tony, you had Tim Flannery conceding that the world was stubbornly refusing to warm, quite in accordance with the climate change models. Look, we will know soon enough what is happening in that particular respect. The important thing is how we respond to it. Now, I think it's important to cut emissions. I think it's important to protect our environment. I don't think we need to go down the path of a great big tax. And your guest last night, your very distinguished and reputable guest last night, doesn't believe in these cap-and-trade systems. He thinks it's the environmental version of selling indulgences, of medieval selling indulgences, and I think he has a pretty good point.
In fact, he wants a great big tax called a carbon tax.
Well, that's not what Kevin Rudd is proposing.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is that whatever the scientific consensus might be about warming, there is now no consensus whatsoever, no economic consensus whatsoever about the merits of Mr Rudd's emissions trading scheme.
Very briefly, have you sought the advice of the Council, or have you asked for any kind of meetings with the Australian scientists? There are many of them who are lead authors on the IPCC's final report.
I am taking counsel from a range of sources at the moment.
Including scientists?
Look, I'm a politician. I'm not going to get into a whole range of scientific argument with scientists.
Why wouldn't a politician want to speak to scientists about this issue in order to inform themselves?
Look, Tony, I am very happy to talk to everyone who has worthwhile input into the best way of responding to this.
But not scientists.
Now, look, the issue here is not climate change so much. It is how do we respond to climate change. That's the job of the politicians. It's responding to climate change. Mr Rudd wants to whack a great big tax on it. Mr Rudd has a tax policy masquerading as an environment policy, right. And I will have a fair environment policy. You know, your guest from last night will be very happy with the policy that we come up with.
Well, because our policy... He will if you have a carbon tax, but I think you've said you won't have a carbon tax.
Let me have a moment. Our policy will directly tackle emissions, and surely that is what we should be doing.
Tony Abbott, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us tonight. First time as leader of the Liberal Party, hopefully not the last.
When did you last have Kevin Rudd on this program?
Soon.
Yes, but when is he coming on?
Well, we'd love to have him on as soon as it's possible.
But isn't that a problem? The Prime Minister of this country will not come on and defend his views on this program the way I will.
Tony Abbott, we thank you very much for that little promotion for the show, and we'll have to leave you there. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Tony.